In her heydays as a sex symbol, Margret had flings with a whole lot of men in the industry, to the point she made the life of one of her female co-stars a living hell. How? This is the untold crazy sex life of Margret, and how her sexual power extends even to the White House. Though Margret grew to witness 8 decades, none was as memorable for her as the 60s. She exploded onto the showbiz scene in a flash of lightning, electrifying both music and movies. As sex symbols go, it was hard to find someone who fit the bill as perfectly as Margret. Her name carried power, and this naturally drew the attention of the most powerful men in the country. She first started off as a singer at RCA Victor. She had such a sexy, throaty, contralto voice that people were falling for her way before they had an idea what she looked like. In later albums, she employed the help of the Jordanaires, who famously sang back up for Elvis Presley. This prompted instant comparisons between Margret and the king of rock and roll, foreshadowing one of Hollywood's all-time great romances. When RCA Victor got wind of the female Elvis comparisons that were making their way across the country, they quickly had Margret record songs that were stylistically similar to the king's. This strategy proved so effective that within 1 year, Margret was nominated for Best New Artist at the Grammys. It's quite impressive how she was winning hearts all around the country without even using her best assets. But that was soon set to change with the release of her debut movie, putting her beauty on display for all to see. Though Margret made her movie debut in Frank Capra's Pocket Full of Miracles with Bette Davis, the movie that made her a star was the 1962 remake of the hit musical state fair, innocent-looking Margret enthusiastically tested for the good girl role. But within a few moments, every studio executive who saw the audition could tell there was something wrong. Margret was just way too seductive to play that role. As such, they instantly made a pivot and made her play the bad girl role instead. This proved to be one of the best decisions ever made in the history of Hollywood. The film was a moderate success, but there was an even bigger advantage. With the release of this movie, Margret's popularity surged into the stratosphere, giving 20th Century Fox another star on the level of Marilyn Monroe. In her memoirs, Margret herself says that this incident perfectly encapsulates the duality of her character. The thing is, she looks and acts and presents herself in a very innocent way. But then, when it comes to playing the seductress, she's virtually unmatched. In the blink of an eye, she can easily transform from being an angel to being a demon. This paradox highlights what really makes a sex symbol. It isn't just about looks. Attitude counts a lot as well. There were a few Hollywood actresses more beautiful than Margret, but none of them could wield their sexuality as well as she could. She was the perfect good girl, bad girl combination that excites so many men. One of the many powerful men who was excited by Margret was none other than John F. Kennedy. Even though he was the most prominent political figure in the country at the time, he had ways and means of getting what he wanted from these women. Now, it goes without saying that JFK's political reputation is impeccable. However, let's just say he was not the most faithful of husbands. For the most part, he was able to keep his philandering a secret. But then tabloids and gossip columnists always got hold of his affairs. One of the highest profile affairs he is said to have had was with screen goddess Marilyn Monroe. JFK is reported to have kept the party going after she sang him happy birthday in her iconic shimmering dress. But do you know who else sang happy birthday at one of JFK's private birthday parties? Yup, you guessed it, Margret. JFK aside, there's an even bigger name who had an affair with Margret. This was a romance years in the making, and one that was absolutely meant to be. When Elvis Presley went to make Viva Las Vegas, he assumed it was just another Hollywood cash grab by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Little did he know that he'd be working with the only woman to ever rival him. As soon as they met, Margret and Elvis started seeing each other off camera. The physical attraction between them was there, but there was also a strong mental and emotional element. In her own words, Margret described Elvis as her soulmate. Since they both became prisoners of the massive success they had acquired as youngsters, they perfectly understood each other. On camera, the chemistry between Elvis and Margret was on a whole other level. With her titillating smile, electrifying moves, and catty attitude, she brought out a side of the king that had never been seen before. The funny thing is that while all this was going on, Elvis was already engaged to Priscilla. But hey, you know what they say? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Now, there were two major threats to the epic romance between Elvis and Margret. The first, as mentioned, was Priscilla, but the second was Colonel Tom Parker. Sure, everybody knows the story about how Colonel Tom manipulated Elvis and robbed him for all he was worth, but few people knew the extent of the paranoia he had about the king. Colonel Tom did not care one bit about the romance between Elvis and Margret. He was only worried that through her association with the king, Margret would overshadow him and become an even bigger star. As a result, he did everything in his power to limit the impact of the movie. Out of the 3 songs Elvis recorded with Margret during filming, none of them were commercially released until years after the king died. Who's to say how big of a star Margret would have been had this not happened? Especially when you consider the left turn her career took in later years. The second threat to this epic romance, Priscilla, was away in Graceland, where Elvis had locked her up in his castle. Now Elvis was not exactly known for his fidelity, but one of the only women Priscilla had felt threatened by was Margret. She was so threatened that she wrote about her in her memoir, describing how jealous she was. All Priscilla could do was sit at home and read about the exploits between her beloved and this hotshot Swedish American. Didn't Margret feel a little bit guilty about fooling around with Elvis? After all, every single person knew he was engaged. According to Margret herself, she didn't think about Priscilla at all. In her own words, she wasn't there. This was such a cold and succinct way to put it. Funny then that Elvis chose Priscilla over her in the end. See, even after the shoot was over, Margret, and Elvis continued to see each other. In fact, they secretly dated for a year. Whenever they were apart, they kept the romance alive with the most exciting of love letters. But then, there was a dark cloud on the horizon of their romance. Dating Elvis Presley is not for the weak. As the biggest star in the world at the time, there were some decisions he just couldn't make. Left to his own devices, he probably would have eloped with Margret. But there were several interests at stake that prevented this. Eventually, he and Margret had to go their separate ways. This led to one of the greatest love stories of all time, concluding with a sad whimper. In the late 60s, Margret's career took a huge dip. After a string of box office flops, her star aura had all but faded. She would have a resurgence in the 70s, but nothing that compared to her prime. It was safe to say that for her, the golden age was over. Now she had flings with many men in the industry. These included Lou Adler, Bo Belinsky, Jack Gallardi, and notorious Hollywood bad boy Eddie Fisher. In the end, she was pinned down by Roger Smith, her manager. Theirs was a 50-year romance that lasted from 1967 until his death in 2017. How was Margret able to find such a long-lasting romance after publicly declaring that Elvis Presley was her soulmate? In her reflection on their marriage, she stated that she knew Roger was going to protect her. They stayed together so long because they both wanted it to work. This just goes to show that even the greatest of sex symbols will give up her lifestyle if the right man comes around. If you enjoyed this video, there's a good chance you'll also enjoy the one showing on your screen right now. Click, enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you on the next one.